Alright, YouTube, it's time for my offensive Halloween costume. You'll notice that very little has changed because people are already so easily offended that they're offended on a regular basis by my materials anyway. I decided to be Vlad the Impaler rather than Adolf Hitler. I think somebody who prevented refugees from entering Europe hundreds of years ago, refugees that at the time were armed, because they're exactly the same thing. The people coming into Europe are young fighting age males. The Syrians are actually families coming in trying to escape warfare. All the other so-called refugees are just a bunch of opportunists who want to displace the local population. And they're united under the banner of Islam, let's face it. They've formed a de facto caliph already, culturally, by their language, by their religious beliefs, and by their beliefs in a social sense. They've decided that Europe is where they want to go so they can get money, but at the same time they don't hold to European values. And the European people are beginning to wake up, and this was the other reason I chose this type of costume. You'll notice I look a little bit like Vlad the Impaler. I've been told that. You'll notice I've got the jawline a little bit, maybe not the Habsburg lip. Had to, of course, do my facial hair in a different manner. But I've already got the hair, and this is what really drives people wild. I'm planning a future video where I just sort of point the webcam at myself in the shower, from the stomach up, of course, and show people that, because some people will apparently get a thrill from this sort of thing. Oh well, I'll give people what they want, I suppose. Maybe people can give me a tip or something on Patreon. But Europe is beginning to wake up. The Europeans now are sending up the cry that they want their weapons back. For decades now, many of these countries have been utterly and completely disarmed. And now they want their guns back. And they want their guns because they don't feel safe. They've learned the lesson the hard way that people over here in urban centers learned a long time ago, which is that disarmament does nothing. It doesn't keep you safe. The right to bear arms, intrinsically, the purpose behind it is to prevent people from being slaves. And you can be made a slave by a group other than a member of your own government. The government can enslave you and abuse you, yes, but so can criminals, so can criminal elements from outside, so can a foreign army. If a foreign military invades your nation and your people are not armed, then you get a situation like you got in the latter-day Soviet years, where people are rebelling against communism and they're trying to fight back with bottles and hammers and baseball bats because they don't have any firearms. It would have been a lot less lopsided if they had had assault rifles at the time to fight back with. They probably would have prevailed, because the butchery, the death toll from the opposing army would have been so high, as opposed to simply lobbing Molotov cocktails and rocks at tanks. It doesn't really do much. Yes, you can burn an enemy vehicle with Molotov cocktails, but focusing on one at a time is a lot harder than if you can mow down the approaching armies that are trying to abuse your population. The Europeans are waking up, finally. It's coming a lot quicker than I thought that it would. Honestly, when I looked at the nation of Sweden, or in latter days, fairly recently, Germany especially, I saw a disarmed, cuckolded public that had no armaments whatsoever for the most part, that was culturally so guilt-tripped that it believed that it had the responsibility to allow itself to be entirely destroyed and displaced by foreign elements which do not hold with the same multicultural tolerance that they themselves have foisted upon themselves. They've deluded themselves into thinking that the post-Soviet globalist era is a new paradigm within human culture, that humans will not relapse back into tribalism and back into nationalism. But it was only a matter of time before they did. And the fact that it's happening now as opposed to happening 10, 20 years down the road bodes well for the Europeans and very poorly for those that are attempting to usurp their cultures. They're going to get purged. People have begun to attack refugee centers. Well, whatever you think about their methodology, it's no different than when the Europeans, under various banners, many centuries ago, did exactly the same thing. Charles Martel raised a peasant army, gave them rudimentary training, and managed to force the Moors out of France at the time. Vlad the Impaler, towards the end, most of the battles that were being waged largely with partisan forces, not regular forces, because the standing army of Wallachia at the time was relatively small. Only a few thousand troops, regulars that is, could have been sustained with the type of economic situation that was present at the time. Thus, he had to draft tens of thousands of peasants in order to actually counter the Ottoman Turks. Again, whatever you think about his methods, impaling, including his own wounded and killed soldiers, impaling them alongside the captured or killed Ottomans that had been trying to invade. It did work. For many years, he managed to hold them at bay, both diplomatically and in a military sense, and prevented the invasion of Europe while Western Europe was still too weak to fight, still too fractured. It gave them time, and they ended up uniting the Catholic and Orthodox churches under one sort of banner, on paper at least, in order to counter the threat from Islam. And that's really what Europe needs now. It does not need globalism. It doesn't need the EU. It doesn't need multiculturalism. It doesn't need liberalism. What it really needs is nationalism. And for all of these nations to embrace their culture, work together on trade, work together in a military sense. But they certainly don't need to dissolve their own borders to some international authority and to destroy themselves with foreign elements. So this Halloween, I'm Vlad the Impaler. I thought it was more fitting. Hitler is, not necessarily the best figure that you can use when you're talking about the preservation of Europeans, about the preservation of Western civilized order in a world that is still largely filled with barbarians, which it is. It's filled with people that, they don't have much in the way of technology. Their cultures are backwards. I don't care what people think about my statement on this matter. But if we look around the world, we can see there are parts of the world where there's virtually no infrastructure. It wasn't the fault of the Europeans that happened. In many cases, what infrastructure does exist was funded directly by the Europeans. Now they're being abused by the Chinese that actually are attempting to abuse the local populations. They're not even investing anything in infrastructure. Where are your multicultural cries about colonialism there? Vlad the Impaler, despite his Christian zeal, of course, I'm not a Christian, is a much better symbol of the defense of Western civilization than Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler ultimately resulted in the destruction of the German culture and its mass rape by a bunch of Mongoloids from Russia, which were exactly the sort of people towards the end that were being drafted for the final blitz into German lands because they had run out of white Russians to fight for them for the most part. Most of them had already been killed. So they simply sent a bunch of people from Siberia and Kamchatka and Central Asia over to sort of fire their rudimentary weapons, most of which were supplied by the United States, if they were any good, at the Germans. It led to the destruction of their culture, and their current scenario in which they're being displaced is the result of the guilt still felt for what they did in the Second World War. Largely, they deserve it. Not in a guilty sense, but in a sense of they're now too weak culturally, too weak genetically to fight back. And so they will be the first to fall, perhaps. Even the Swedes are waking up now, but the Germans are still deep asleep. You couldn't have convinced me that would be the case 10 years ago. Unfortunately, now it's true. And so this year, I'm Vlad the Impaler for Halloween, so happy fucking Halloween. Because we're being invaded from the Eastern world to the West. Not here in the Americas. We've got a new world situation over here. We're just fine. I think perhaps people in the United States that are adopting these extremely far-left attitudes, really the reason why they're doing that, they don't really get to see the problems that are going on in the parts of the civilized world that are more in proximity to the Middle East, in which people are far more guilt-tripped. We don't have guilt from the Holocaust to have to deal with. We don't have guilt from the Soviet era or from any of these other purges throughout time to have to cope with for the most part. So we're still relatively fresh and young and capable of dealing with these problems as they come. The Europeans have so much baggage that it will be an uphill battle to convince their populations that yes, you have the right to exist. Yes, your language and your culture may be defended, because they were based on the ethno-state principle. They weren't based on the principles of the New World, because they were already established long before the New World was even found. The cultures there are far older. Not the borders, not necessarily all parts of language, not necessarily the governments or the monarchies, or any of the systems that are in place, not necessarily the flags, not necessarily the nation states' names, but the cultures. The original cultures are far older than the cultures that compose the United States or any of the other American countries, except where they're based on the pagan tribalism of prior cultures. You would think of perhaps Peru, the Peruvians or the Bolivians or something of that nature. Other than that, it's fairly new. The same with Oceania and some of the other countries in the world. Europe's not like that. The age-old struggle of Europe versus the Arab people goes back many centuries. It even predates, by the way, the rise of Islam and Christianity. It goes back to the period of antiquity, the period of empires. It's as old as Alexander and Darius. In fact, it's far older than that. But that would be the most appropriate metaphor that we could use for what's currently going on. It's the struggle between Western civilization and Eastern civilization. It's the struggle between the new way of doing things, looking at people as sentient, and the old way of doing things, looking at people as part of a conglomerate, sort of to be ruled over by some monarch or oligarch or theocrat or something of that nature, to be ruled over and to be told what to do. Europe is in fact the gap between the New World and the Old World. It formed the New World, but it clung to the Old World systems, which is exactly why they were weakened over time. Their empires fell. They weren't willing to embrace the new way of doing things that developed in the Americas, first and foremost based on that ancient European system, founded in Greece during that same period of Athenian democracy. And we've got quite a storm of grackles going through. I've noticed an abnormally large number of swarms of birds, so clearly this is something out of a horror novel. But yes, hello folks, I'm Vlad the Impaler, telling the Europeans, wake the hell up before it's too late, because right now you don't have any great leaders to keep outsiders from utterly and completely destroying your cultures. And yeah, I hope this offends people. It'll be rather funny to see people's reaction to such a video. That's about all. Peace out. Deus Vult.